I'm William O'Flaherty, and welcome to another special extended edition of 90 Seconds to Knowing C.S. Lewis. Today, I'm sharing the entire one-hour interview I did with C.S. Lewis's stepson, Douglas Gresham. It was recorded in November 2019, but I only obtained a copy at the end of April this year. Previously, I had an audio-only interview with him back in 2013. See the description below for a direct link to it from my All About Jack, a C.S. Lewis podcast. To keep things easy, I'm including the portion I shared in the preview show that contained 13 minutes of the time I spent with Gresham. I wanted to take you back to the books themselves, since we're talking about Narnia, and let us reflect on when you first read the Narnia stories, what was your reaction then? And then compare it or contrast it with your reaction or impression today.
Well, it really hasn't changed very much. Of course, now I understand a great deal more about what Jack was saying in those books. But when I first opened The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe and started reading it as a child, I was enthralled by the whole thing and very, very thrilled by it. And of course, I still am. It's a book I read frequently. Partly because it's my job to do so. When anyone wants to make a play or something out of The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe or any of the Narnian Chronicles, it has to come across my desk for me to give it the okay or not, as the case may be. Over the years, we decided that we had to put sort of guidelines out for people to understand why they shouldn't do some of the things they wanted to do in these plays occasionally. And I think only once in all the hundreds of them we've done over the years, only once has one lady gone off in a huff and said, "Oh, I won't do it then." I said, "Thank you," because her script was abysmal. But it's interesting because I sometimes get to a point in a script where I'm not sure whether what they've said is accurate or not, and it doesn't feel right. So then I have to reread that part of the book again. So I'm sort of reading them constantly, all the time, at home in my office. I lead an interesting life. I get up around 4 a.m, and I start doing my emails, amongst which there may be scripts to do. And I usually get to bed around 9 o'clock at night. And anything can happen in between. But I try to get the Narnian work out of the way first. And then all of the emails that come into my computer I have to answer during the day. And so it's interesting. I have a lot of fun. I also get a lot of outside work as well. We grow our own olives and stuff like that.
Okay. Yeah. Well, now, I think you referenced about The Horse and the Boy being dedicated to you and your brother yesterday. That was back in 1954, a few years ago. Well, what was it like to have that honor? And would that be your favorite book, or what is your favorite Narnia?
I actually don't have a favorite Narnia book. It's whichever one I happen to be reading at the time someone asks. They're all so good, and they're all so valuable to a person reading them, that I think it's probably wrong to try and pick one out and say that's my favorite. Particularly in my case, because I have to reread them all the time. But I have favorite characters.
Okay.
Reepicheep is one of my favorite characters. Absolutely. And in fact, in the films we've made, I've got favorite characters among the actors too. Jim McPhee, who played Tumnus, had this beautiful semi-Narnian accent until somebody called cut and says, "Right, did I get that right?" Because he's Scottish, But he's a very, very fine actor and a nice guy. And the girl who played Lucy is an absolute darling child. And she changed from being that sort of interesting, chubby-looking little girl to being one of the most beautiful women in the whole of Europe, in my estimation, and I'm an expert, believe me. She's a gorgeous little girl. Not that little anymore. And, of course, Anna, who played Susan, is now married. And the one thing I told her years and years ago is, "Whatever you do, don't marry an actor." And she said, "Why not?" I said, "Because if he's any good at his craft, you'll never be able to tell when he's lying." But she married an actor anyway, and I think they're doing very well, I hope. So those two are two of my favorites, and of course Jim. And there are others too. I mean, the guy who played King Peter for us, he was lucky to get the job, get the task, to get the role, because he didn't do a very good audition. He was too nervous. And I watched him on that audition about 6 times over and over again. And somebody said, "Well, we think we're going to drop him." I said, "Don't." And they said, "Why not?" And I said, "Well, if you study him, not his acting talent in that interview, in that role, but just study how he behaves and how his mind works while he's doing this, and you'll find he has huge strength of character. Now, that young actor, I think, did King Peter extremely well in our movies. And he's still acting. And a while ago, a couple of years back or more, he was playing a role up on a hillside somewhere outdoors. And he and his co-star were in this particular scene. And lightning struck them both. And they were sort of knocked unconscious. And when he woke up, he found that the whole crew had fled into safety, leaving them lying there. Seriously. So he gets up and he staggers over and reaches down, picks up his co-star, the girl, and walked with her into safety. Now, that's the kind of lad we had playing King Peter, and he can play King Peter for me any day, anywhere in the world, any time. He's a superb young man. I have the greatest respect for him in his reactions to things like that. And of course, Skandar was a great actor and a bit of a he was a bit of a mischief maker at the time. If you had a glass of rum and coke on your table at the bar one time, wherever you happened to be, and you turn your back and Skandar was around, it would sort of go down about that much, because he was much too young to drink anyway. But I pulled one on him. I filled a glass with Fernet Branca. I don't know if you know that, but it's a very, very bitter tonic thing. God, he took a sip of that and nearly choked. We had a lot of fun making those movies when we weren't busy working. And even when we were busy working, sometimes it was fun. It was a good experience.
Well, speaking of the characters, you're starting to talk about that. Someone asked me in terms of the characters that were similar to or inspired by or some elements in real life. The classic one, of course, we're aware of. I'm sure maybe many have heard that Puddleglum had elements from Fred Paxford. And then someone else suggested that maybe Diggory might have been inspired by your brother David. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but any other characters that Lewis
I don't think Diggory was inspired by anything to do with my family. He's too nice a kid. But I think that Jack had this weird, strange, foreboding kind of skill about him. He was quite able, and often did, whether meaning to or not, write a character whose characteristics and behavioral patterns belonged to someone he hadn't met yet but was about to. Mm-hmm. Eustace, for example, would have been closer to my brother than anybody.
Okay.
No, seriously, my brother was a paranoid schizophrenic and a violent one. And I spent most of my young life, trying to avoid being killed by him, quite seriously. He was dangerous. And later, he eventually died on Christmas Day on 2016. And he was in a secured institution in Zurich at the time, a psychiatric hospital. Now, I love my brother, and I still do, but he was dangerous to me all the time. And so he was not anyone that Jack would have chosen to write a character about. I think, but probably it was. Eustace was written long before he met my brother David, but Eustace was about the closest we can get in Narnia to any of our family, except, of course, I think that Shasta and his brother Corin. I say Corrigan because my boat is called Corrigan, but anyhow, I think they are probably both based on me.
Oh, okay.
Because I was a boxer and I was the one who rode horses all the time and I got up to all kinds of mischief, like both of those did. So yeah, they're great characters, and I'm very glad the book is dedicated myself and my brother, and I'm very glad to think that I can see myself in both of those characters.
Mm-hmm. One last question for myself, and
before we go on, Fred Paxford you mentioned.
Okay, yes.
Puddleglum. I should tell you that Puddleglum is not just based on Fred Paxford; he is Fred Paxford. Fred was our gardener, and he turned out to be a stalwart man for me. He was a great help to me in many, many ways, and I loved him as much as I loved Jack and Warnie. And of course, he's dead now as well. But he was a wonderful man. But he did have this uncanny and kind of slightly weird habit of always suggesting that the very worst was going to happen in order to stop it from happening, because he really believed that the good things were going to happen instead. Mm-hmm. It was like, if you said, "Good morning, Fred," he was likely to say, might be all right now, but it'll hail or rain or snow later on. You wait and see, This is the middle of the summer, And I remember one day when Warnie came into the kitchen, Fred did a lot of the shopping for us, and he used to ride his push bike into Headington and buy all the groceries and bring them back. And he used to buy 1/4 pound of sugar for a household of about 5 or 6 people. One day, Warnie just sort of lost it a bit. said, "Fred, why do you keep buying such a small quantity of sugar? You know we need far more than that." Fred looked him up and down and said, Major, but what would happen if the world come to an end? Where would we be with 4 or 5 pounds of sugar on our hands?" But he was a wonderful man. And I'll remember till I die. The day after my mother's funeral, the day of my mother's funeral, I'd just come back from it. And I wanted to be away from the house and the people in it. So I walked away across the drive. And there used to be a lovely weeping willow in the grounds just past the drive, past the hedge. And behind that was the brick shed and so forth. And there was a lovely fence just facing up to what used to once be a tennis court. And I was leaning on the fence and just crying my eyes out, which is, I suppose, quite normal for a 14-year-old child who's just lost his mother. And all of a sudden, this massive arm laid down across my shoulders, and I looked up, and it was Fred. And he said, "Don't cry, son. It'll be all right in the end. You'll see." And there were tears running down his cheeks. He was an amazing guy, and I miss him to this day. Puddleglum.
Puddleglum, yes. Well, I do have several movie questions, but I had one more book question in terms of transitions and such. But what was it like then, since you read the books as they came out? What was that experience like? Any reflections, excitement?
It's very difficult to think back to when I was 8 years old. I mean, I'm 74 in a couple of days' time, as you probably know. But yes, I had read lots and lots of children's books because I was a bookworm from as early as I can remember. And actually, I went to a school once, and the only good thing in the whole school was the library. And they had about 150, 200 books there. I read about half of them and thought the rest weren't worth it, and wondered what I should do next. So I read the Encyclopedia Britannica, which they had there, twice, from end to end. And some of that stuff stuck in my brain when we were making The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. I was just watching some camera screens, of all the cameras on different screens, so you can watch what's happening in each camera. And our line producer, a very, very nice guy, came into the tent behind me with his young lady, a very lovely girl. And they stood there watching me for a few minutes. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, Philip said, "Doug, how many species of tuna are there?" I said, "Well, there used to be 8, but now there are 7 because one's become extinct." And he turned to his girlfriend and said, "See, I told you." Sorry, what were we talking about? I forgot.
The experience of the books
right.
as they came out when you were young. Yes.
The greatest thing about the books is I knew there were going to be more. When you're reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and coming toward the end of it, you think, well, this is going to finish. It doesn't, because there's another book coming. And I was just completely wrapped in them and read every one as they came out. And I still enjoy them enormously. I must have read them probably 50, 60 times each. But the experience of coming across this whole atmosphere, the atmospheric feel of England, which resonates, or Ireland, probably Northern Ireland, resonates through the books, was fascinating, absolutely amazing. The fact that it took you somewhere else, and it took you to somewhere beautiful, which had problems the same way as our own world does. At that time, I was living in upstate New York, which is a lovely, lovely part of the world. And I could imagine that where we were was part of Narnia. Then later, when I lived at the kilns, the wood up in the lake up behind the kilns became my personal private Narnia. But the books they changed my life, and I think they probably changed the lives of everybody who reads them. For the better, I hasten to add.
Oh, yes. Now, we won't dwell too much, because you mentioned you weren't involved in the 79 animation, and there was actually
Is that the one we just saw bits of?
Yeah, the bits
Thank
of,
God
yeah.
I wasn't involved in it. I'm
you
very grateful for that.
A few views, but there was an even earlier one that there are some YouTube clips, fortunately or unfortunately, from 1967.
Yeah, that wasn't any good.
That was so.
It was all right for its day. Both of them, I suppose, in a sense, were all right for the mentality of the people who made them, and all right for the day in which they were made. But they really weren't what I wanted to ever see on the screen for Narnia. And later on, when I actually made up my mind when I was starting to get involved, started to sort of form, I suppose, we were just getting it going, the C.S. Lewis Company. And the first Star Wars movie came out. I looked at what he'd done on the screen with that. I thought we can now put a real live lion on the screen, and nobody will know it isn't a real live lion. And in fact, I was at a college somewhere and speaking and doing a talk for the people there, the students. And in the aftermath, I'm standing sort of front of the stage down, and all these kids came clustered around me, as they do. And one girl said, "Can I ask a question?" I said, "Sure." She said, "Was that lion real?" And I just couldn't resist it. I've got a little imp of mischief. He still lives in there. And I couldn't resist. And I said, "Well, actually, I'm the one who had to write the awkward letter." She said, "What do you mean, awkward letter?" I said, "Well, originally, Lucy was played by identical twin girls. And I had to write to their parents and say, we're terribly sorry to have to tell you that our lion ate one of your daughters yesterday." At which point, everybody in the room cracked up, roaring with laughter, and this girl suddenly got very embarrassed. And I gave her a hug and said, "Don't worry, lots of people ask that question," which isn't quite true, but some do.
Oh. Now, before we get to the Hollywood ones, that we saw the clip twice for the one, but you mentioned, I think, the BBC did 4, Lion, the Witch and Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and The Silver Chair. Was there any involvement there? I know there was limitations.
No, I wasn't directly involved. They did sort of ask me a few questions, and I helped as best I could. And I quite enjoyed what they'd made of it, under the understanding what sort of a budget they were working with.
Right, yeah.
Because in those days, the BBC didn't have a great deal of budget going for it. And I think they didn't do too bad a job, but I think we did it better.
Yes. Now, maybe it's on record somewhere, but they didn't do the other stories just because they ran out of budget or the rights they didn't.
I think it was probably a budget issue. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I was not fully involved in those days either. I was just a sort of I was running a farm in Tasmania, for heaven's sake, which is quite a long way from the BBC. But I got it back to England every now and again, and I forget where, but somewhere they asked me to give them some advice on bits and pieces here and there.
Okay.
But I was a farmer. What did I know? I had also been a radio and television broadcaster for years before that, but that's beside the point.
Right, a little different medium. Now, one last question before we go into the Hollywood movies about the play versions. You made reference to things have to come across your desk. I know you're quite familiar with the Logos Theater in South Carolina. If you want to say a few words
the
about
Logos
that.
Theater in South Carolina is a remarkable piece of engineering and human engineering and all of that, and a remarkable bunch of Christians. And the first time I went over there, I was absolutely astonished at the quality of first of all, the script. The scripts that are written by people who want to make a play of one of these books come across my desk for my critique. It's part of my job. And the first script I got from Nicole Stratton, was absolutely brilliant. There was very, very little I had to change. A couple of small points I made, and she wrote back and agreed with me and changed them. But there are very few, and there are 2 people in the world now to this day, I mean, that was years and years ago, but there are 2 people in the world now to this day whom I know when I get a script from them, I know it's going to be really good, and there'll be very little work I'll have to put into it. And one's a lady called Luna Indosian from Manila, and she is with a company called the Trumpets Theatre Company there. And the other is Nicole Stratton, who is at the Logos Theatre. And they have moved from being a small amateur training company in terms of acting and so forth, into being a first-class professional theatre company. And their work is astonishing. I love the work they did on the next one after. I didn't see their Lion, the Witch and Wardrobe, but I saw the one after it. And that was, I can't remember which one, it was Prince Caspian, I think. It was absolutely beautifully done. And the quality of the acting they get out of the young people who work with them is amazing. I just recently, not so long ago, saw their version of The Horse and His Boy, which was breathtakingly good also. But in it, they had a problem at one stage because the girl I think that they were going to get to play Aravis was either sick or something and couldn't do it. And they didn't have anybody. And a mother arrived and said, "Look, I've got my daughter here who doesn't seem to be interested in anything. Would you possibly take her on and see if you could teach her a little bit about acting and stage and so forth?" This girl was 13 years old and had never acted in her life. After the first few rehearsals, Nicole suddenly realized that they had a real talent here. And she told me this. And I said, "Well, I'll see it, just show me the play and I'll see what I think." And I was absolutely amazed. This young lass came on. Most of you probably have read The Horse and His Boy, right? Yeah, good. Because at the beginning of the relationship between Shasta and Aravis, Aravis hates him because he's a dirty, scruffy fisherman boy and doesn't want anything to do with him. And of course, slowly as the book goes along, and he turns out to be a hero bit by bit, she becomes more and more fond of him. And in the end, of course, falls in love and marries him. But this 13-year-old girl, I can't remember her name, unfortunately, but she started exactly right, disliking him and being nasty to him and so forth. Very, very gradually and slowly through the whole length of the play, you can see in her eyes and her facial features, the way she moved, everything about her, that she was starting to not dislike him anymore, starting to like him, starting to really like him, and at the end, starting to love him. And she does these changes by the slightest change of facial expression, movement, and she's coached, of course, by Nicole, but she just turned out to be a very, very brilliant young actress. And I hope that she stays with it, because she'll be a star one day if she does.
Oh, very interesting. Well, now, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe came out, of course, in 2005. But take us back to the years leading up to that. About how long did it take to go from idea to when it was finally released at the end of 2005?
Well, it felt like about 4 centuries, but it wasn't. Everybody thinks that you want to make a movie, bang, you get into it. It doesn't happen like that. It can take years and years and years to get it up and running. And this one was remarkably short in terms of span. I don't think it took us more than 4 or 5 years to get it up on the screen. But it's a complicated movie, as you probably know. We had to make a lion go running around, and wolves and people too. We had centaurs. Oh, the lovely one of the centaurs happened too. I was asked by another girl, and I think this was actually at Liberty University, I'm not sure, who, in all honesty, asked me if the centaurs were real. And I couldn't resist it again. I said, well, we found this wonderful sort of stretch of green pasture land in New Zealand, which nobody had ever been to because there were no roads into it. The only way in was by helicopter. We had the helicopter in, and we built 9 kilometers of road, by the way, to get the people in and get the equipment in there. But we found this great empty space, and around the edges there were bits of woodland. And we were just sort of measuring and wondering what we were going to place where and so on. And all of a sudden we saw these very, very weird people creeping slowly out of the shadows of the trees. And her eyes were about as big as saucers. And everybody standing around but trying hard not to giggle. And finally she realized that I'd been having a lend of her. But I mean, we do get the most extraordinary situations when you're trying to make a movie happen. For example, there was no way into this place, but it was obviously the very perfect place for the battle scene. So we wound up building, I think, 3 bridges and 9 kilometers of road just to get our equipment and things. Everything else had to be helicoptered in, including me. I was helicoptered in. But it was an amazing place to work. And it worked out beautifully. We had these great rocks on the top, and you had this wonderful, wonderful plateau where the 2 armies could clash into each other. But these things take a lot of time and a lot of thinking, a lot of discussion. The scripts themselves, for Narnia particularly, take a lot of time and work from me and others. And the first movie, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I was happy with the scripting at the end. I had a lot of arguments with, with people like Andrew, the director, who's a really good bloke, but he makes mistakes like everybody else. Mm-hmm. And we had some arguments about this and about that and about the other thing and so on. But that always happens. In the end, I was very happy with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe that we completed. And the box office was equally happy. Mm-hmm. And we did very well. And I think it's probably still selling bits and pieces here and there. In fact, most of them are. The next one took slightly less time because we knew what we were doing by then. All the experiments we'd had to do in Lion Witch were sort of ironed out. And so we came out and we did Prince Caspian, I think it was the next one.
Right,
Prince
yes.
Caspian. And by the way, I play a cameo role in all of those films, just for the fun of it. And in the first one, you may remember if you've seen the film recently, when the children first arrive at the professor's house, it's a big house and everybody's a little bit nervous. Particularly Lucy is quite frightened. And so she goes to bed early and the other kids come into her room to comfort her and make her feel at home and so forth. And as they walk in, there's a radio playing on the sideboard or sort of side of the room. And it said something like, "And last night in London, German bombers," click, they turned me off. That was about all I got from the camera. And in the next movie, which was Prince Caspian, there's a scene right at the beginning where the doom falls because a town crier is announcing that King Miraz has finally had a son. And of course, that puts the death penalty on Caspian very quickly. And I'm the guy up in the tower, saying, King Miraz has had a son, everybody's got to rejoice or they'll probably get hanged or something. I can't remember the script. So that was my second one. And the third one, which is my least favorite of all the movies we've done, I liked Caspian, but I think there were a bit silly points in it which I objected to, but was howled down by the director and others. One was the kiss between Susan and Caspian at the end of the movie. I thought, how stupid can you get, really? But I still think it was an utterly stupid thing to do. And many, many people have phoned me or emailed me or written to me and said, why did you let that happen? The answer is because I wasn't directing and I couldn't really stop it. I was just an advisor. But the third one is my least favorite of the movies. And I got my favorite cameo role. And there's Lucy up on a stand being auctioned off as a slave. And I was the first slaver to actually bid on it. I was full costume, and even my sons couldn't recognize me. And 100 for the little lady, I think was my line. And I was very impressed with myself because I managed to impress the crew. And that doesn't happen very often. But that's a movie that I think got slightly lost in itself. And I fought a lot of battles, some of which I won, some of which I lost. But I wasn't completely, and still aren't, completely happy with it. It took a considerable amount of money at the box office. And a lot of people love it. And it's actually brought a lot of people to Christ, as the other two movies have as well. So I mustn't grumble. But it's not the way I would have made it, quite frankly.
No. Well, I know I've heard you address elsewhere regarding the challenges of keeping the movies faithful to the books, but I don't know that everyone here has necessarily heard you. Let's spend a little bit more time on that in terms of the challenges, since the director has that more say than you, but many people kind of like look at you and say, why did you let this happen? And of course, you didn't have total control. So we heard this morning, of course, about how adaptation from a book to a movie is quite different. But if you want to maybe summarize that, or some examples of the battles that you did fight and win.
Well, I think one very simple one was in the last movie, the third movie. They had for some reason, to start with, people don't understand there is no Christianity in Narnia. It doesn't need it. It's got Aslan. So Christ doesn't appear there. So they built this big, weird cathedral-like building. And it had statues all the way down the sides of it. And initially, they were a statue which was completely copied from a statue in France, in Paris, of which the sculptor, I believe at the time, was still alive, which was a saint supposedly holding his head in his hands and walking away from having been executed. Saint somebody or other. Can't remember his name now. I looked at it, I thought, I've seen that before somewhere. And it was quite recent. And it suddenly clicked in my mind that I'd seen it in part of Paris, Montmartre in Paris, some of the roads there. And that was when I was illegally traveling around France, but let's get over that.
Okay.
And I thought, I wonder if this guy's still alive. So I looked him up, and he was. I didn't tell him that they'd stolen his statue and repeated it 24 times. So I went to the guy and said, look, guys, you can't do this. To start with, there aren't any churches in Narnia, so we mustn't have it look like a church. And you've got this guy sort of looking like a bishop, holding his head and walking around, about 16 of them around this great... I don't know why they did it. Anyway, so they had to rip them all apart and start again, which I was quite gratified by. That's one I actually won. But there were a lot of others that I didn't. I can't really go into too much detail anymore. That's a long time ago. But I was never quite happy with that film completely. There were things in it that were absolutely gorgeous, some wonderful things in it. There's a scene, for example, where the albatross flies across the ship. When Lucy prays to Aslan to give her a sign that he would help when they're in dire straits with dragons and goodness knows what else. And there are bits and pieces that I think are absolutely wonderful in that movie, but I wish we could have made it slightly better. I always wish we could make them slightly better, to be honest. Even with Lion Witch, there were things I would have changed.
Right, yeah.
But then I'm very, very picky about such matters.
Speaking of the Lion Witch and the wardrobe, if I'm not mistaken, that movie did so well that at the time also released, either just before or just after, was King Kong, and the Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe sold better.
Well, of course.
Yeah.
Naturally. I mean, really, giant apes are all over the place.
Yes, yes.
Most of them are in our... Never mind. Shouldn't say that.
Now, I think there was a passing reference even yesterday in terms of with Prince Caspian, but in terms of since The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe was so successful that maybe some of that in terms of try to do different things. But one of the different things in terms of a question is it came out in the summer versus the winter. anything stand out in your mind as to why that decision was made, or?
I don't know why I really don't know why that decision was made. I thought it was idiotic at the time, and I still think it was idiotic. Every one of the Narnian books are really Christmas releases. Mm-hmm. It's obvious if you think hard enough. Of course, people in Hollywood aren't real good at thinking hard enough, I'm not sure, but some of them aren't anyway. Some of them really are. There are some wonderful thought thinkers in Hollywood. Well, Hollywood is no longer existent in that sense. It's the film industry of Los Angeles now, really. And there's some lovely, great people working it too. But I did not understand why they released that when they did. And I still don't. And I think had they released it at Christmas, we'd have done a great deal better with it. And with all of our movies. I mean, let's face it, we had a wonderful time with the Royal Gala premiere of Lion Witch, because we took over the whole of the Albert Hall. Not the Albert Hall, is it the Albert Hall? A big theatrical thing in the middle of London. I should know better than I don't. Anyway, enormous marquee was set up across the road. And we had Narnia reenacted in the marquee. And we had hundreds of guests. But yes, it's the time to release the third one, actually. Voyage of the Dawn Treader was released in winter. And they put a big snow machine because they weren't sure that there was going to be any snow. So as we all walked in the red carpet bit, the snow machine started, but it was snowing already, so I didn't really need it. And it was very, very cold. But Her Majesty was quite pleased, so it's the most important thing.
Well, one last question about the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and I want to look ahead about some things, although you did mention there's really no news, but I want you to maybe bring us up to what we've come to since the last Narnia movie. But on the last one, the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, you were noticing the bittersweet, you have some favorite elements of it, but then in terms of least satisfied, those weren't your exact words, but just any final comments about the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, things that you fought over and won versus what you had to compromise over?
Well, the interesting thing about making that movie and looking back on that movie now is there were some things that were done absolutely magnificently. Mm-hmm. The ship, the Dawn Treader itself, I'd go to sea in that vessel, quite happily. It was so beautiful. It was beautifully built and beautifully done. And then when we had to sort of make it look destroyed, we sort of did it again. And even that was beautiful. Mm-hmm. Some of the characters were superb. Most of them were superb. There's a lot about that movie that I do like very much. The Green Mist was originally an idea I had, but it was taken and completely changed. They wanted to have some kind of presence of evil. And instead of sticking the book, they were going to have a witch or something. And I said, that really won't work. So I suggested they should have Narnia itself reacting to evil presence, just with something like an oozing ground mist coming out of the ground, slightly grayish green color, which I think would have been very effective. Instead, they came up with this strange fog. I don't know what you could call it. And when I first saw it, I was completely horrified. I thought, what on earth did they take my good idea for and turn it into a carnival show? You know. Anyhow, that's one thing I didn't really like very much about that movie, and I thought it was completely misplaced. But there were wonderful actors. We had some locals in Australia. We shot that in Australia, and some wonderful people working on it. There was a young lass who played the star's daughter, Lily Andil, as I named her, and Laura Brent is her name, and she's still acting. Very beautiful young lady. And they made two gross errors in promoting it. To start with, they forgot about promoting it to the Christian community. Oddly enough, there were no Christians on the set except me, I think, and a couple of guys I persuaded that it was a good idea to look into it. But suddenly they suddenly figured out that they hadn't done anything to promote this movie to the Christian community of the world. So they said, well, who's a Christian in this organization? They looked at me, and I think I did about 150 interviews in 3 months, and didn't sleep much. So when the premiere actually happened, I was absolutely exhausted. I met Her Majesty the Queen for the second time in my life, and enjoyed talking with her briefly, as we always do. And then she moved on, and I've got the video to prove it. Prince Philip showed up and shook my hand and chatted with me for about, again, 3 or 4 or 5 minutes. I have absolutely no recollection of that at all, except that I saw it on the video, but I just wasn't really conscious anymore by that stage. So, I mean, but it was it was a wonderful situation. But the problem with being just a kind of consultant producer or executive producer or whatever they decide to call you, because all of those titles are basically meaningless, is that you can't make things happen. You can always only do your best to advise in the best way you know how. I was brought up by the man who wrote those books. And I probably know more about them than anybody in the world today, because everybody who used to know a lot about them is now dead. And it just seemed like folly to me. If you've got C.S. Lewis's stepson working for you, and he advises you on the book, why don't you listen? If somebody was doing that to me, I would certainly listen. If my tractor breaks down on my farm or something, and there's an expert guy for that model next door, he's the guy I'm kind of talk to and turn to, you know? Anyhow, that sort of thing happens in Hollywood. It's just interesting. And there's an awful lot of ego, of course. And a lot of the credits one gets, like executive producer, are mostly just to make you feel good. You know, they don't necessarily mean they have to listen to you or anything like that, or executive producer or whatever it is. But it's an interesting industry. And I really hope that someday along the line I'll make a movie which actually gets an Oscar. Because then I'll be able to get up in front of a whole big theater full of filmmakers and tell them what I think. And oddly enough, it's not going to be nasty. I think we're in a difficult situation in the film business because none of the people in it realize how important they are. They really don't. The movies we make today, in this particular era, particularly more than anywhere any other time, hugely influence the thinking and behavior of young people. Anybody under the age of about 40, actually. Their whole thinking processes are changed by what they see on the screen and how it's delivered. And I think at the moment, the result is that the young people of today's world are going downhill in an ice bucket. And it's unlikely that this generation will ever, and probably the next two, will ever recover from it, unless the people making movies and entertainment media of all sorts wake up to how desperately important they are to the young people of the world today and do something about it. And if I... Thank you. So if I ever get up there on the Oscar stage, that's what I'm going to tell them. I think they need to know it. And they need to realize and do something about it. We have had such incredible talents working in the film industry, and yet they throw it away by aiming these things in the wrong direction. While I've got you here, I'm going to give you the works. Another of my real peeves is this whole superhero business. Superman and people like that and all the rest of them they've invented. All we're doing with that is telling God that he got it wrong. He made man incorrectly. This is the way we ought to be. We ought to be able to fly. We ought to be able to break, steel bars over our fingertips and so on, whatever they do. We are actually insulting the God that made us with this kind of movie. I think that has to be changed too. So tell all the young people you know to get busy and change it.
Well, now, it's been almost 10 years since the last Narnia movie, and while the history is just too long to maybe recount, but summarize in terms of essentially why there was that wait. Is there any good way of summarizing?
We weren't waiting so much as trying to get the thing done. We were trying to get the Silver Chair made.
Right.
And we were started off with a film company that had a very lovely young lady who really understood Narnia and really understood how to make a film in it. But unfortunately, during the course of the events that took place, we finally had, after much work on it, a very fine scriptwriter write a very fine script, which I thought was great. It was really, really good. And then a man took over the headship of the studio we were working with and decided he didn't like the script. He wanted it his way because he owned the studio, or didn't own it, but ran the studio. And so it turned out in the end that he changed it all around, or had it changed all around, or his people changed it all around into being a girl power action movie. And I said, no way. And I said, guys, we're out of this. We turned around and walked away. So that made a big dent in the time we had to do it. Eventually, we talked to several other theaters, other studios. But the problem was they got hooked on this idea. This is another thing that happens in Hollywood. Somebody comes out with a film the type of which nobody's ever seen before, like a girl power action movie. And suddenly everybody says, wow, they made money on that. Let's do it. And they're all making the same damn film with the same misdirected ideas in it. And it goes for about, 6 or 7 months, and then everything disappears because they start to not make any money anymore, which, of course, is what the film industry is about, making money. So we really thought that if this is all that they want to make, we're not interested. And so we just stopped. And from then till now, we haven't really done any work on it.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is the deal with Netflix, which you mentioned. There's essentially no movement, but is there any clarification at this point, or it's still being discussed? The information that we've seen is saying films and series. Does that mean some episode? What's
Well, actually, I would love it to be an episodic thing,
Uh-huh.
because with a movie, you have an hour, maybe 2 hour maximum if you really stretch it, to put an entire book, an adventure storybook, into the film, and you just can't do it. You have to drop out so much good material. If you go to an episodic streaming system,
Mhm.
you can put the whole book up there, and if you really were stupid, you could add to it, which I would have no intention of doing. But I would like to put the entire book, every single nuance of it, on the screen, and I think we could make fantastic Narnia movies that way. But we did a deal with Netflix, and since that deal was done, I have not heard a word from them. So I can't tell you, and I don't know what's going on.
Mhm.
I've no idea what's actually happening in their offices or what they're getting up to.
Okay.
So I can't answer any questions about that. I wish I could, because I'm kind of getting worried myself as to whether anything's ever going to happen in my lifetime anyway, because my lifetime isn't that long now, Mind you, I still drive big motorbikes and fast cars and stuff like that. So haven't given up yet.
Well, you were noting in terms of that they don't, they may ask, but they won't necessarily follow your advice. If they were here today and say, it sounds like you are in favor of the episodic, like a TV series or episodes but based on the book. But if they said, okay, we'll give you carte blanche, would you go with the silver chair? Would you say, let's do a reboot and go back at the beginning? What would be your preference if you had?
Well, that would depend entirely on the budget.
Mhm.
If we had a big enough budget, I would start all over from scratch.
Okay.
And put everything in the book in the films, one after the other, and we wouldn't take a break in between. We'd just keep going until we'd done them all. And it would take a massive budget, of course, huge budget. I don't know whether that'll ever happen or not, but I do think it would be a huge advantage to be able to get every single little nuance of the book into the film, because it'd be much richer and it would be much more entrancing, and people would just sort of drop everything and dash to the screen when the streaming thing came on or whatever it was. I don't know how it works, honestly. I've actually never watched a movie in that format, so I don't know. But it's just we just wait to see basically what's going to happen next.
Okay. I had on Facebook, I asked some people to submit some questions. There was a long list of different things, but one that stood out, there's probably no real answer other than somewhat predictable, but someone asked, would there be the possibility of collaborating with Peter Jackson in the making of The Magician's Nephew? So any reaction to that?
This guy is obviously a betting man, right? I have no idea what Peter would say about that. He's made some wonderful stuff and he's made some awful stuff. If we had Peter Jackson working with us, I'd have to watch him for the awful bit. No. He's a nice guy, by the way, so I'm told. I haven't met him yet. I've worked in New Zealand quite a lot, but never ran into him. But he's done some wonderful work in the past. But I don't think we'd need to collaborate with anybody. If the right people are working for us already or working with us already, we wouldn't need to. If we get the wrong people, as we did slightly in Dawn Treader, then it's our own fault if we're in charge. If we're not in charge, there's not what we can do about it anyway. But I would love to make these movies, and if I can find someone who has the skills, though I must confess, The Hobbit, nah. Come on, who are you playing with? This is ridiculous. Anyhow, I didn't like it.
Yeah.
The Lord of the Rings I did like, but I thought that it's a pity it had to be so short and cut so much out. There was such a great deal of meat that was missed in the books, and all 3 books, that you could have done it far better in a streaming situation and do the whole thing. So it's just I don't know whether Peter Jackson is up to making a Narnia movie. I really don't. Until I meet him and talk about him with him at great length, I wouldn't know.
Right. Okay. I've got maybe one or two, and then we might have time for one or two from the audience. So my people who are going to do the mics can get ready. So let's see. I think you made reference to this or answered it, but let me ask it directly to make sure. In terms of on Netflix, whenever things do start to happen, is there any possibility of going beyond what Lewis actually did in the books? In other words, to fill in the things that we don't necessarily know what happened to other things.
I don't know the answer to that either, but I can tell you one that I do object to strongly, and that is the people who write me screenplays or books on why Susan went to hell. Ugh. To start with, we don't know where she went,
right,
at all. But I think the point that Jack's making is that, you can't guarantee that you're going to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
You can't guarantee that your sister is going to heaven, or your brother, or your uncle or aunt, or anyone else. We just don't know. And we're not supposed to know.
Mm-hmm.
We're not supposed to know where we're going. So Susan goes up there and she stays in this world. She doesn't go back to Narnia and the new Narnia that emerges from the destruction of the old one. And everybody says, why did C.S. Lewis send her to hell? Well, he didn't. The people who ask the question are the people who are sending her to hell.
Mm-hmm.
And I usually answer that particular question when it comes across my desk as an email or something like that, pretty strongly, to try to point out that it's not up to us to decide. So you don't have the right to say that she's gone to hell. You don't have the right to even assume that she's going to hell. If you see a drunk in the street falling around and hitting people, you do not have the right to say he's going to hell. None of us do. We don't have that right ever. We also don't have the right of saying so-and-so is going to heaven because he was such a great preacher. We just don't know. Because we don't know what happened inside his head, inside his heart, in his life. So this is the sort of thing we have to leave to God. So please, anybody out there who gets word of this, do not write to me and ask why Susan was sent to hell.
Okay.
It's a pain.
All right.
Anyone in the audience want to ask a question?
So,
someone over there, yes.
Hello. Okay. Thank you. I wanted to know, I know fantasy is often such a hard genre to bring to the screen and to bring to life. And what do you think are some of the factors that would make it successful, that make successful fantasy adaptations, especially in these beautiful stories?
What makes it so successful? If I knew that, I would probably be a billionaire by now. There have been some fabulous films made with beautiful intent and beautifully done that have just flopped, and nobody knows why. It's an interesting dilemma. I think with Narnia, it's much easier because you've got all the material in the books to use, and it's proven its way. We're now translated into, I think, almost 50 languages for the Narnian books and others of Jack's, but mostly the Narnian books. And they're distributed around the world. The Faroe Islands, for example, which got about 6 people living on them, have got them translated for their children into Faroese. And a young American girl asked me and said, "Oh, you mean Egypt?" when I said Faroese. It took me a while to wake up that she was talking about the Pharaohs, and I gently explained to her that wasn't quite what I meant. But yeah, you've asked a difficult question, actually. But you're entitled to. You're young. I'm old. But, it is difficult to assess. As I say, we've got about 50 languages now, all over the world. We probably have, in terms of the books, we probably have a reading audience of something like 400 million people, because we've sold about 200 million copies of the books worldwide, various languages. How we translate all that in our minds is up to the individual, I think, really. How you work through the ideas that Jack came up with, the way he wrote them. I don't think you'd ever get anybody who could write a Narnia book as well as Jack did. People have tried, believe me. And one or two of them came across my desk and got hurled against my office wall. But there are some very, very well-intentioned people. There's a particular girl at the moment, and I just haven't had time to finish reading her script. But she has written another, and she's saving Susan, of course, which is not our right to do. But it's very difficult to assess what people's motivation is in these things. But I have not yet read a book by anybody on the subject of Narnia that has been good. Young people is fine. They've got a lot to learn. And if they're learning to write, that's tremendous. I'll support them all the way. But older people who write may say, "Dear Mr. Gresham, I've just written a book and my children think it's wonderful, a new Narnia book. My children think it's wonderful. My wife thinks it's great. All my friends think it's good and we should publish it. Can I please publish?" And they start reading it. And you wonder just how stupid the people are that he associates with, or just how kind they're being. You know, because one of the things I've always done all my life is read. I read all the time. I buy books when I get on an airplane. In fact, I bought 2 on the way here. And my motto is that if the book is really good, it comes home with me into my library, and I've got about 1,500 books in my library now. And if it's not, it stays on the plane, which is cool. You don't have to throw it away. You don't have to feel guilty. Somebody else can pick it up and read it. But reading is something I do all the time, and therefore I think I've developed a reasonable judge of what's good in Narnia and what isn't. And I'm still getting people who send these books in occasionally, and usually they accept what I tell them and thank me very much for putting my effort into it. And then they say goodbye politely. One guy stormed off. And I never heard from him again, thank God. Does that answer your question at all? Sort of. Yeah. It's a difficult question.
We have another question up here.
Hi. As you've gained experience in cinema and adapting the films, has the way you approach adapting Narnia changed?
How's the way well, it'd have to if we go to a streaming version. If we're going to be episodic, we've got to put the whole book together, so it'll be a totally new thing altogether. I don't think anybody's done it yet. Certainly not with Narnia, anyway. So it's going to be interesting and fascinating work. I'd love to be the guy doing it, but I doubt whether they'll let me, because they don't think I know enough about Narnia. Most of the people I've worked with don't think I know enough about Narnia or about filmmaking. So they sort of sideline you if they can. But I don't know. I would love to get to work on rebuilding the cinematic part of the whole thing from the book by using the book, every single nuance of it, every attitude that comes up and so forth. I think we could use to great measure in an episodic version of episodes 1 by 1 and do the whole book. I think that would be wonderful. I don't know what's going to happen. This is the problem. Nobody has told me anything yet, and I'm still I've been living on tenterhooks for about a year now, waiting for information. I just don't know what's going to happen. But I would love to see it happen. I think it would be wonderful, a wonderful opportunity to really put everything that Jack wrote into these books onto the screen. One of my great ambitions to do one at least before I die. So God's in charge, basically. Mm-hmm. Thank you. I hope that answers your question again. Yeah. We're moving into very murky places here with how to do these things. As yet, nobody has ever really tried to put, for example, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe entirely on the screen and give it the chance to really work. Because the book is so full of richness and wonder that if you put the whole book up there, I mean, I think you're going to have millions of people wanting to see it. Does that help? Thank you. Ouch.
Anybody else? Or we get a
one right up there at the back. Yep. You got a microphone up there and another one over here.
There.
You'd have to be very loud. I'm partially deaf. Too many years of gunfire and tractors, I'm afraid.
I'm just curious. Sorry, it's very loud. I'm curious if there's ever been a discussion about taking the Ransom Trilogy or Till We Have Faces to stage or screen.
You've just named 2 of my great ambitions in life. I've been working on it in my mind for years. Haven't yet got anybody who really wants to do it or even understands the books, which is part of the difficult part. You go to your average sort of producer or company and they say, "What does this mean?" I said, "Well, if you give me the opportunity to put it on the screen, I'll show you, But it hasn't happened yet. I would love to. Absolutely love to do those moves. I think that Till We Have Faces is probably the best book my stepfather ever wrote of fiction. And I think it's probably his greatest work of fiction. It was a collaboration between him and my mother. And they did it very, very well. It would make a fantastic film. I think it would probably do as well on the screen as Lion Witch did. It's just such a wonderful story. So I hope that answers your question, but it's just the way it is. Nobody really seemed interested except me. And I would love to be able to do those books.
Okay. Do we have time for anybody else?
Well, I have. I don't know about you.
Okay, yes.
I'm coming. I don't move as fast as I used to. This will be the last question.
Going back in time, did anyone ever approach, Hollywood ever approach Jack in the 50s, early 60s about turning any of these books into films?
No, and it's a good thing they didn't. He wouldn't have allowed it, because the quality of the films at that time simply could not have done what we did. We put a live lion on screen. And he as soon as you turn the film off, of course, he ceases to exist. But the quality of the characters that we can make out of, like Reapercheap, for example, all these characters we were able to put on the screen simply could not be done back then. And when Jack was approached on one occasion, somebody wanted to do it in sort of Mickey Mouse version. And he was absolutely horrified at the thought. And I agree with him. And when people wanted to make movies of it earlier on, as soon as I was in charge, I said, no, we're not going to do an animated cartoon version of Aslan any more than we would of Jesus Christ. So we just stopped. We did have an offer from one production company in LA, and they eventually came up with a script. And I was living in Ireland at the time, running a Christian psychotherapy and counseling ministry with my wife. And I read this thing, and I literally hurled it at the wall about 4 times. It opened up with a scene of smoggy clouds above Los Angeles, and a helicopter dangling a massive lion effigy on the bottom of a long. It went on with Edmund and the rest of the kids being exiled from America to England because Edmund had been caught stealing CDs from a store. It just got worse and worse and worse. And I thought, what the heck is wrong with these people? You know, what do they think with? You know, just suet pudding, I presume. So, I mean, that was the kind of thing that Jack would have absolutely deplored. And I literally that bounced off the office wall. I got so enraged, I hurled it at the wall 2 or 3 times. I've sort of grown out of that childishness now. That was only about 30 years ago. Yeah, so that's about answers your question, I think.
Okay. Is that all? Okay. Yes, well then, that's all then for this evening. Let's thank Douglas Gresham again for being here.
I hope you enjoyed this special extended edition of 90 Seconds to Knowing C.S. Lewis. Be sure to visit the website I have, essentialcslewis.com. I'm William O'Flaherty, the creator of this show, and I'm also the author of 2 books, C.S. Lewis Goes to Hell and The Misquotable C.S. Lewis. Finally, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and like this video and share it with others.